Welcome, everybody. As a New York Times fanatic, I'm really honored to introduce Gal Beckerman. He has accomplished so much since he graduated in 1998 that I'm not entirely convinced that there's only one Gal Beckerman. He had his first book contract at the age of 27 when They Came for Us Will Be Gone, which was chosen as a book of the year by the Washington Post and the New Yorker. His upcoming book, The Quiet Before, on the unexpected origins of radical ideas, is about to be published and seems very appropriate for Reed College. While continuing his day job as a writer and editor at the New York Times Book Review, in the past year, he finished his second book and earned a PhD from Columbia. So thank you so much for being here today, Gal. And to get started, perhaps you could tell us about some of the themes of your new book. And then, of course, I think many of us are curious about your life at the Times.
Thank you so much, Marge. And I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be back at Reed, if only virtually. I am also eager to get to the Q&A too, because I feel like that's where it could get really interesting. And I'd love to talk about my work at the book review. But I think you're right that maybe a good introduction to sort of the things I've been thinking about and writing about could be to talk about my book. I will say that the book comes out in February, so this is officially the first time I've ever sort of presented the book publicly, but it's very apropos that it should be in a setting with fellow Reedies, because I feel like this is a safe space, and you guys won't look at me sideways when I stop making sense. Think of it as a seminar, as one of our classes. So basically, the best way I think I can explain what this new book called The Quiet Before is about is to tell you sort of how I got to the subject. I really started thinking about these themes back in about 10 years ago, about 2010, 2011, when there was a lot of what kind of became known as Twitter revolutions, and particularly the Arab Spring was a moment that I felt very tuned into. And there was so much sort of enthusiasm at the time about what these new forms of communication could provide activists and revolutionaries, that my natural sort of Reedy skepticism, was sort of attuned to the ways that it might not all turn out as everyone hoped. And in fact, what I saw, what we all saw, I think, is that though a lot of these, the social media was helpful in sort of getting people to the square very quickly, to the public space to gather, to protest, it ended up not being so useful in terms of, particularly when you looked at a place like Egypt, in allowing groups of people to form an opposition, to really to understand who they were ideologically as an opposition, to begin to create sort of a political force that could counter the much stronger, longer forces that had been in that country for many years. So it seemed to me at that moment, and in the months and years that followed, that social media had held out this promise, and it had not really delivered. And the piece that had seemed missing in terms of what that form of communication couldn't provide was really a place for people with radical ideas, people who wanted to upset a status quo, people who wanted to imagine a different sort of reality for themselves, a place for them to actually gather and talk amongst themselves in some kind of private or semi-private setting, where they could essentially sort of huddle. That the attributes of social media kind of didn't allow for that. I mean, we all know what sort of social media can feel like, even in our private communications, the way that it feels like we're talking to each other through megaphones sometimes, the performative quality of it, the fact that it moves so fast, that, it's social in the way a cocktail party is social, where the person who's like tells the funniest joke or is the loudest is where all the attention turns. But it doesn't provide that aspect of sociability that allows for a group of a vanguard, let's say, to sort of gather together in a small group and figure out sort of what they want to be as an opposition, how they want to take on established powers. So, social media didn't seem to provide this, at the same time that it became more and more clear to me that this was the dominant way that kind of public discourse was going to take place, was in these forums. And I started thinking about forms of communication that existed pre-digital. And I was thinking about this precisely because my first book was about dissidents in the Soviet Union. It was about the movement to free Jews from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And in the Soviet Union, that movement was very much centered on a group of dissidents who used samizdat. And samizdat was, I'm sure most of you heard the phrase before, underground writing, self-published, distributed hand to hand. And it was a way that they could communicate amongst themselves and sort of develop their ideas. And the research I had done really made me understand the way that it was central in allowing them to maintain their almost like a shadow civil society in the middle of a very repressive regime. So I started thinking a lot about samizdat and sort of what samizdat gave the dissidents, why it was so useful, and in contrast, especially to like a Twitter or a Facebook. And there were a few sort of central features that it occurred to me samizdat and maybe other kind of pre-digital interactive forms of communication, like letters or petitions or small newspapers or zines. Most of us remember zines from the 90s. Or samizdat itself, other forms of communication that were allowed for sort of interactivity before there was an online space. And what they provided a few features, right? They were baked into them was a certain sort of patience, a certain sort of slow thinking. People communicated, over, not quickly, but over time. They allowed for a kind of cohesion, a space for people to kind of come together and to maybe shave down some of the sharper edges of their own ideas so that they could fit better with others. It was a spaces for imagination, for people to kind of dream together without worrying about sort of being seen from outside, sort of dream, imagine realities that hadn't existed quite yet. And it was a place to focus when it's easy to, when you're starting a movement or a new idea, to be distracted. And ultimately also some way that they had control over the medium that they were using. When social media, as we know, these are privately owned companies, we don't control the way that we can communicate on them. So all of these features felt very important to me as a sort of ingredients that were necessary if you have a radical idea and you want to sort of come together with other people who share that idea and incubate it. I mean, if we can think of incubation, I hate the word because I feel that it's been sort of abused by Silicon Valley. But incubation is really what I'm talking about. What happens, before the protest, long before the protest, in order to make it actually the most effective kind of protest that it can be. So that's sort of, those were the kind of initial thoughts from which the book's main idea evolved. And I began to look for examples in the pre-digital world, going back 500-600 years, to where people used forms of communication that in fact had these features. So just to give you kind of two chapters very quickly, one looks at letters before the scientific revolution, and I focus on a French aristocrat in the 1630s who was part of the Republic of Letters, which was this huge network spread out all over Europe of intellectuals who were sort of communicating amongst themselves through letters. And this one aristocrat had the idea to measure, to find the true measure of the Mediterranean Sea. It had never been, it was the longitude, which was needed in order to find out that measure, was not yet known in any kind of scientific way. But in order to figure out longitude, you had to get many people spread out all over, geographically, to observe a single kind of celestial happening at the same time and mark what time it was when they saw it. And if you shared your data, the difference in time would give you longitude. And this sounds easy, but it was actually quite hard in 1630 to do this. And letters are the only way to coordinate it. And not just that, the people who are spread out that far, to the corners of the world are mostly missionaries who are religious. This is the age of, Galileo being persecuted for his ideas, and other people, being burned at the stake for having anything that ideas, scientific ideas or proto-scientific ideas that counter the church's doctrine. So this one aristocrat used letters to sort of convince these far-flung missionaries to kind of get on board with this project. And the letters, as I started reading through them, it was interesting just as a medium how important they were in sort of him moving these folks towards what then was in fact a radical point of view, which is that the earth isn't at the center of the universe, and that we can do sort of observation that uses our own eyes to test truth. And so that's an example of, where, and he managed to do this. He managed to carry off, basically they all observed an eclipse together. And about 50, 60 people spread out all over the known world at the time observed an eclipse. And they managed to figure out that the Mediterranean was about 200 miles shorter than everyone had thought it was. But the point was that as a part of this process, through the letters, those people were brought along to a different way of thinking about their relationship with the world. Another example I have is another chapter I have takes place in Accra, in what's now known as Ghana, in the 1930s, and some of the first African-owned newspapers. And these were, again, spaces of incubation where the kind of very, very small African elite who had gone to Europe and come back, and then also the young people who were growing up in Accra, in what was known as the Gold Coast then, and starting to gain some kind of professional academic background, where they took to the opinion pages of these newspapers. These newspapers were essentially opinion pages alone because they didn't have money to pay for reporters. It was mostly almost like a newsletter where different people would contribute. And they would argue about all kinds of things in these pages. And it became sort of their place to incubate some form of national identity, because everyone, it was a society that had been quite tribal before. And here they could argue about, when we go into modernity, what are we going to think about polygamy? A question like that was a barrier in some ways to thinking about how to embrace the sort of a sort of wider identity than the ones that they had traditionally. And they could do that on the page. They could do that through the op-eds that they were putting in these newspapers. So I found many examples like this, that were opened up sort of this whole stream of communication that felt like it was moving underneath, the great books that we know of the last 500-600 years. And it was really one that was interactive in a way I think we always sort of imagined that the internet would be, that it would be this place where people could come with common interests, radical interests even, and sort of communicate amongst themselves and cook up new things. And instead what we got was a world that is, highly, that pushes us towards certain kinds of conversations. I guess that was my ultimately, what concerned me was that the forums that we use to talk online pushes us towards a certain way of communicating. It forecloses certain kinds of conversations, and it kind of limits us to others. And so, I looked at this long history and sort of the lessons that I could learn from these various examples, and then tried to look at the last 10 or 15 years at everything from the Arab Spring to Black Lives Matter, to even the white supremacists, who gathered online before they went to Charlottesville in 2017, and looked at where those spaces exist for us online today, because we mostly, when we do think about these sort of quiet corners where people huddle amongst themselves, I think we largely think about them in pejorative terms as places where bad things happen. And the argument of the book is that, actually we need those spaces too for the Black Lives Matter activists. We need them to have a place where they can gather amongst themselves, figure out who they are, figure out what they want. And when we lose those, we lose kind of an essential part of beginning to make change in the world, that you need the space apart, the non-performative space, the place where people can actually think and cajole and argue and push each other and egg one another on towards some kind of common understanding and a common set of goals. So of course I went on longer than I wanted to, but that is my very scattered first stab at explaining sort of the genesis of this book. I'm happy to talk about it more. I'm also happy to talk about what life looks like at the book review, and any other questions that you all might have.
So please do tell us what life does look like at the book review. And of course, we always wonder, like, how do books get chosen to be reviewed? What's the process?
Yeah. Well, it's always so funny to be like where the sausage is being made, because I think there's a lot of mystery and obviously a lot invested, particularly on the part of books people, people that care about books and authors, and in terms of how these decisions are made. I mean, the one thing I would say is that we're very much just like people, that a lot of these decisions are entirely subjective. I mean, they're all subjective, but we try for some degree of thoroughness in the way that we look at books coming in. We actually technically do look at every book that's published. I mean, every publisher will send us their books. And I mean, I can tell you a little bit about the methodology, because maybe that's interesting. There are three sort of top editors who go through a first cut of the books that come in, and you can imagine what our mailroom. I mean, now we haven't had this. We've been dealing with PDFs for the last year, but you can imagine what our mailroom looks like. So there is kind of a first cut made, and then there's a number of editors like me. There's about 5 or 6 of us who each have sort of subject areas that we're in charge of. So my purview is I deal almost exclusively with nonfiction, and I do all of the kind of social science nonfiction, so philosophy, religion, technology, environment. I won't, like, for example, like a biography of Lincoln won't come to me, or like a World War II history won't come to me. There's like another guy who deals with that. I have a lot of books. I joke that all my books have like, and how it changed the world in the subhead, that's the genre. I get, books by neuroscientists, like that category, some hard science too. And also weirdly, I also do all the graphic novels. That's somehow been attached to me as well, which is fun because it's just like a completely different register. And so I will every 2 weeks, and again, this is in the analog world, we've had to work a little differently in the last year, but every 2 weeks I'll get like a huge carton of about 60 books. And I have to go through them. I have to what we call preview them. And the previewing process is, I basically put it this way: there's about 30% of books that I know sort of right off the bat I probably will assign. I will assign because I know that they because of either the author, who the author is, or that there's something about the subject that immediately grabs me and feels original to me. I will sort of put aside and say, I'm pretty sure about this, so I don't even really need to crack it open. There is 30% on the other end of the spectrum where I will look at it and go, this is now the upteenth book I've seen about, whatever subject. I'm not going to call any out because, something about, it seems too academic. A publisher sometimes is one response that we have, or I'll just, you can take a quick look and it's also thinking about like who the audience is of the Times book review. But then the hard part is that middle gray, and that is where you have to start reading into the books and you need to, and again, it's sort of a highly subjective thing. I think there's days where, like, one day I would decide to assign a book, and another day the same book might strike me differently. I think one of the things I'm aware of more and more, especially as we're much more a digital publication and kind of moving away from what the Times' book reviews existence was for so many decades, which was this big fat review of all the books. We could really review a lot of books and feel comprehensive. Now we're much more focused on online, which I kind of went into the job with a lot of fears and skepticism about kind of trying to serve our online audience for all the reasons that you would think, kind of worried about where that would push us as a publication. But I've kind of come around to respecting and a lot more the tastes of our audience, who are into all kinds of things, and the numbers tell us this. But I do think a lot when I'm about to assign a book, what kind of review it's going to turn into online and what audience it will serve. So a lot of sometimes it is like, oh, this is like the 10th book I've seen about how emotions work, and it might be like a wonderful book, but I by like a neuroscientist I haven't heard of, but if it's the 10th book, I'm not going to post a 10th book review online that on this subject, which is a different calculation than when people were just thinking about the print product and it was just one review among many and you would forget about it 5 weeks later. So I make my decisions. I pull out my books. People have asked me sometimes what percentage. I'd say out of those 60 books, I'd say there's like 15 to 20 that I will have assigned. And then is the most creative part of the job. This is the part of the job that I love the most, which is I get to think up who would be the most ideal person to review the book. And because we're the Times, like I can really think of anybody that I want, and the most fun reviews that I've done have been with very kind of left field people, just getting their take on a book because it seems it would be a good match or an interesting match. That's a very kind of creative part of the job, is thinking of like who would be who has enough knowledge in this subject area, which is always with my books, that's always a factor because some of them are very specialized, but who has enough knowledge, but would also bring sort of like a fresh take and would be interesting to read on that particular book. And then I come up with 3 or 4 names and I sit with you guys you're getting the whole step by step. I hope this is interesting. And then I sit with with the top editor, who right now is a woman named Pamela Paul. And I pitch her the books. And I mean, she never turns down a book, but sometimes she'll look at my list of 3 or 4 people and she'll say, well, we have that person just doing something else, or I don't like that person, take them off the list. That happens too. But I emerge from that meeting with a list of people that I'm going to assign, that I want to assign, and I start going down the list. One of the issues that we deal with a lot at the book review, because we care a lot about just the ethics of looking like we don't have any conflicts in terms of the reviewers and the authors, is sometimes I'll have to go through 3 or 4 people before I get to the person who has absolutely no connection to the author, and it gets quite Talmudic. You have to I played tennis with his wife 25 years ago, so is that okay? And then eventually you get your reviewer, and then the review comes back. And I mean, the lucky thing is that so many of the people that I'm assigning reviews to are really professional writers, writers who know what they're doing. And we like the reviews to sort of have a lot of voice. So there's not like, I mean, every once in a while I have to rewrite a review, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, we're letting a lot of voice in. And so the editing part of it is not the most intensive part of the job. It's mostly just sort of moving the copy through, making sure that everything looks good, and pushing the writers here and there to be clearer. But yeah, I think I in quite a lot of detail I covered it.
Meanwhile, I hope, I die before you can no longer get the print version of the Times.
Yeah, no, I'm one of the diehards yeah.
I see many questions in the chat box, Carrie.
Yeah, we've been collecting. Okay, so one clarifying question, Gal, like
Yes.
going back to your discussion of the first chapter you were kind of discussing from your forthcoming book, there was a figure you were referencing in the chapter about the letters.
Yes.
What was the name of that person?
His name is Puresque, Nicolas Fabry de Puresque. And the incredible thing about him is he left behind 100,000 pieces of paper. That's his legacy, was the letters that he had. And he didn't write any books, but he coordinated experiments, for 20, 30 years throughout this Republic of Letters. His letters have all been digitized because he's such an important figure for that particular moment in the Republic of Letters. The Republic of Letters in itself is a fascinating topic because it was this way that scholars communicated amongst themselves during the wars of religion during that period of time when universities were completely co-opted by one side or the other. It was hard to travel, and so they used letters. And these were also people. What they were doing was subversive in a way because they were questioning the fundamental dogmas of the church when it came to the natural world. But they were doing it. This is why I think letters are so interesting, because they weren't doing it in the way Galileo did it, by writing a book that was just going to trumpet some new truth about the way the world works, or the way nature works. They did it in these sort of small incremental accumulations of knowledge. And they, writing reams and reams of, letters to each other about the most esoteric, small things you can possibly imagine, and sort of thinking through it all together.
Thank you. Another question. Do you write about how Big Brother can access even supposedly dark online sites and selectively, according to what Big Brother values, interfere with, or worse, take actions against views to the contrary?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a fascinating topic. My book sort of doesn't, it's not so much about that kind of surveillance aspect of our lives online, although I am sort of pushing against the idea that, I mean, there's a lot of by the end of it, when I'm trying to find these places online where people can talk amongst themselves, I don't find the perfect medium necessarily, but I think that there is a sort of a movement, even on something like Facebook. If you remember a few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg said that he now wants to turn Facebook from being the town square to being living rooms, that there is a strong desire, or the success of chat apps like Signal or Telegram, that do have quite sophisticated encryption. I mean, I have no doubt that Big Brother will find a way around them one day, but for the time being, that really has become a place where activists can sort of talk and feel fairly confident that they're not going to be listened in on. And so I think that the push for sort of more privacy is such a strong impulse that that I think that desire is there, and capitalism being what it is, I think that there will be a way to achieve some level of that, for the groups, for the types of communication that I'm talking about, at least. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we have a couple of comments and questions that are along the same line. So, you have this, you have these spaces online that are kind of tiny communities in and of themselves, right? Bread baking or focused on writing. But, people have been in Facebook groups that, do foster sharing and incubation. So it's sort of bringing that up against this sort of thesis that you have about social media replacing these other forms of communication that foster communication. Do you assume that social media is precluding other types of communication that you think foster more in-depth communication? So kind of how are you seeing those things play against each
Yeah,
other?
no, it's a great question, and it's important for me to clarify this. See, this is really good because I'm getting you're pitching me the questions that I'm gonna have to deal with. I think there is an interplay. So let's take an example. If you look at Black Lives Matter and the kind of iteration of Black Lives Matter in 2015-16, which was really the first moment when the hashtag took off. And the movement really was tied to these moments of, brutal, violent moments of captured of police killing people, and every time that would happen, the hashtag would spike and attention to the movement would spike. And what I'm arguing is that and it's not just what I'm arguing, it's actually what I've heard from tons of activists who are involved in Black Lives Matter, is that their reflexes became conditioned by those spikes, that it became a question of following and pursuing that attention and trying to figure out how to grab onto it and how to achieve it again. And at some point, this became a very exhausting, and ultimately it felt kind of futile to them because they were just waiting for the next moment when news of a shooting would happen, and then, or some form of police brutality or a terrible video, and then they would, it was easy then to, the hashtag would spike, everyone would go out in the street and protest, and then it would die down again. And the feeling developed among many activists that there has to be a way that we detach ourselves from that, what I like to think of as a metabolism, and find a way to talk amongst ourselves in the ways that I've described. Because otherwise, we can't actually fully take advantage of those moments. We can't even take fully advantage of what social media is good for, which is drawing attention and creating that virality, right? So, I looked specifically in the chapter on Black Lives Matter at a group in Minneapolis, actually, who, after that first wave in 2015-16, they called Black Visions, and they basically decided to, go dark, just go offline, actually, go off of social media, become a small group that really spent a lot of time strategizing, building relationships with the local city council, actually eventually getting people on the city council that they felt were going to be sympathetic to their big idea being that money needed to be moved away from the police budget. This is the defund idea, although they've also, in their incubation, are come to understand that defund is probably not the best way to explain what they want to do. They're trying to reinvest in other forms of safety in their communities, of public safety that aren't the police. So how do you get that done? And they had lived through 2015-16 constant protests, and they felt that the sustainable structural difference they wanted to make just wasn't going to happen following that metabolism. And so they really, they talked to each other on Signal, on these encrypted apps. They only let in certain people into their group, and they formed these relationships with policymakers, inside legislators inside their own cities, so that when the summer of 2020 happened and the biggest spike of all big spikes occurred after George Floyd's murder, they knew exactly what to do. They had incubated on their own in their own private spaces. And if you remember, it was in Minneapolis that the city council came out and actually pledged to end policing, which was shocking in the moment, and then eventually kind of got pushed back in a big way. But their relationships were so advanced at that point with the city council and the local powers, that they managed to get, by the end of 2020, I think $8 million from the police budget moved towards this new Office of Violence Prevention, I think they called it, and which is a small but not insignificant win, and something that could not have been possible if they were just following the Twitter metabolism. It happened because they made a conscious effort to get off. And so I guess that's a long way of answering the question, but what I mean to say is that there is a place for both modes. You need to know how to take advantage of what social media can provide. But the big misunderstanding, I feel, of the last 10 years is the belief, and this is why I said in the beginning that I the Twitter revolutions were what kind of set off this chain of ideas towards this book, was the belief that social media was going to be the one and only answer to everything. That if we just learned how to, manipulate those hashtags, make them work for us, make the viral quality of it work for us, that was going to be the answer. And I think the journey that a lot of these activists have been on over the last 10, 15 years was realizing that, no, it's just one tool. It's one tool with very particular features to it, and that we need to appreciate the necessity of the quiet before, of the moment where we huddle together and incubate and do everything that needs to be done to make sure that we actually have our goals set properly, that we're on the same page, even that we have a sense of leadership, that we know who's actually the one who's going to go talk to the politicians when it's the moment to talk to them, and not, we think about something like Twitter as being this beautifully decentralized form of communication, but it's actually not. It becomes that the people who best know how to work Twitter are the ones who have the most followers and have the most influence. And it became an incredibly frustrating thing for these activists in 2015-16 to watch how certain people who they felt weren't really on the front lines, weren't the people who were the most sort of in tune with the various demands of the movement, were the ones who were being invited to the White House, who were being feted and put on covers of magazines simply because they had the largest follower count on Twitter. And it's because they knew how to do Twitter, which is a very particular kind of discourse. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I do think that it's what I would hope people would draw from the book was a sense of the balance of the two, of understanding that these are tools, and we need to know which one to pick up at which time.
I have one more question on this theme, and then several about the New York Times Book Review.
Sure.
So up to now, new media moves ideas faster and cultural advance becomes more robust. In social media, does information and disinformation move so quickly that we have moved into a world where information and hence cultural growth has become unstable?
So is the speed making things unstable? I think so. that's kind of why that's a lot of why I wanted to do this book, because I do feel like there's a lot of lessons to be learned, and I don't just want to be a Luddite who's saying that the internet is bad. That's definitely not what this book is. It's more saying, I think that we've ignored forms of communication that have a lot to teach us from the past, and those forms of communication are, they have a lot of the features that we like about being online. They are interactive. They do bring together community, and which I think is what our great hope was for the internet. But they also are slower. They also allow for deliberation. They are more private in that you have to sort of there's an entry cost. You have to sort of identify with the movement before you enter into it, or identify with this circle of people. And so I think that it just leads to more sustainable forms of change. It just leads to more robust movements. It doesn't go. I think that part of there's a very wonderful social scientist named Zeynep Tufekci who identified, this problem kind of early on in 2010, 2011 with a book called Twitter and Tear Gas. And what she described was, the way that movements could go from 0 to 60. All right, let's say call them radical ideas, could jump from 0. You want to take down the regime? Great. But the fact that because you could use a Twitter or a Facebook and go from 0 to 60 just so fast without building all these, I describe these various features: patience, cohesion, focus, imagination. Those are all internalities. It's like the strength of what makes a movement actually allow itself to sustain. That you could jump over all those steps and get 100,000 people in the street. So externally, it looks incredibly powerful, but it's actually empty inside, because you haven't built the thing that happens after that. Great, you've a huge show of force, but then what happens? And so I do worry that because we don't value those spaces, because the metabolism that we've come to think of as useful for social change, that the Twitter metabolism, that we are ignoring the need for those, for the small spaces, and we're also ceding them to the white supremacists who actually have figured out, or I don't think they have figured out, they by necessity, because they couldn't exist anywhere else more public online, they've taken advantage of the ability to have these small spaces where they can actually get themselves together, become more organized in ways that have shocked all of us over the last 10 years. Yeah.
Great. All right, on to the New York Times Book Review questions. So there is an opinion, well, I think Jim would say that this is fact. Why does the New York Times and the New York Times Book Review review so few books on science and engineering?
This is my big crusade in life every day. I'm the guy who does science. I have to say that I'm always pushing for more science books. The problem is writing, there is it makes me, I don't take any great joy in saying this, but I don't come across a lot of science books that are written in an accessible way for a popular audience. I mean, they exist, but and when they're good, they're very good. But it's just I feel like I end up with a smaller pool of books that I think I can put in front of a New York Times audience, which is a lay readership who, like but it's also, I try to do a lot. I just did a book yesterday. I just published a book on a review of a book online about quantum physics. Quantum physics, I barely understood enough to be able to edit the review. We're talking about highly specialized esoteric science, but I take that question as a further prod to be better. I have to say that it's not, I'm always presenting books that I want to have reviewed, but they jostle against the lighter fare. It's funny because last weekend we had every summer we do a summer reading issue, which is one of our biggest issues of the year, and we have a series of roundups that we have in there, where like one author will look at like 5 or 6 books. And the letters in response to the issue came in the other day, and it was all people just upset. Why did you leave off? Because the roundups are like sports, music, theater, light summary topics, right? And people were like, why did you leave off? Why isn't there no science roundup? Another letter, why is there no poetry roundup? Another letter, why is there no, somebody thought we had neglected to do self-help, which is necessary in this moment. But it seems like whatever we do, there's always going to be some books that we leave off. So my hope is that the final tally is one that, represents a broad range of genres, but I will keep pushing for those science books. I will definitely do that.
The Reedies demand it. On average, what percentage of the given book that you're considering for the review will you read word for word?
A very small. I'm sorry. Well, no, that's not. It depends on the book. Some books I will read, and I will occasionally read a whole book, but that I'm previewing. But I have to, I have 60 books in 2 weeks. There's a quick process, and sometimes it's unfair. I have to say, I'm feeling this myself now. With this book coming out, it's interesting to be on the other end of it. I've been an author of a book already once before, but I was not, at the book review then, of course. And now I'm really, I know the kind of snap judgments that are made about a book just based on the external features, on the title, on the cover, on the things that you don't want to influence your thinking, but they do, because you have to quickly categorize books. You have to sort of decide what is this I'm looking at? Is this a science book? Is it a technology book? Is it a book that's written in a sort of a literary style, or is it a more kind of an academic book? Like there's a lot of factors that sort of that sort of force you towards those decisions more quickly than I would like to believe that I try to take as much time as I can. But now I'm worried about it with my own book, because I'm like, well, people understand what this is, because I'm the one who, am making those decisions every day. And it's made me very sensitive to the idea that, a book needs to sort of quickly communicate in a clear way what actually is in it. But I try to be very fair, and read as much as I can into. We among the previewers, we talk about reading into books, so some, it's how much of the book have you read into, and so but I'll often read, a chapter or two, just to kind of get a sense, especially when it's, like I said in the beginning, it's really the ones that are truly on the fence, and where it's just a question of like, does this speak to me as the editor? Can I imagine handing this over with excitement to a reviewer and saying, go for it, even if I think like there's flaws with it, is it past a bar where I think that a reviewer is going to have something meaty to engage with? Yeah.
This is a biased follow-up question, but do you believe your read education and your human experience might have assisted in your ability to preview a book and distill strategically its value?
No, next. No, everyone, I'm just kidding. Of course, Reed was hugely formative for me. I mean, I grew up, my parents are immigrants without much education. I didn't grow up in a house with books. I mean, they're wonderful, loving, supportive people, don't get me wrong, but they didn't have that. That wasn't something that they gave me. It's something that I really worked to acquire for myself. And coming to read and being in a place that's so treasured, the process of learning, was a revelation. And just like, that sense of finding your people, of finding other people who are going to be as excited about ideas as you are. And I'm sure everyone shares this feeling about Reed, but I often think back to those courses and having to say smart, interesting things, and with other extremely smart, interesting people. We have, the part of my job actually that most reminds me of like a Reed seminar is and this is one of the more fun parts of my job, is that we have to decide every year on the 10 best books. And it's a long process that we start at the beginning of the year, and then we meet every few weeks, and we try to, it's essentially like a glorified book club. We're each trying to read a few of the books that we have picked out as possible contenders. But it's, I suddenly find myself in a room with other really smart, accomplished people, and that same kind of reedy tingling of, what are they going to say and what can I say and how can I sort of, take their idea and sort of refine it and move it. So all of that has very much stayed with me, and it's extremely formative for sure.
I accidentally muted you, Val. I'm sorry. All right, I've got 2 more questions because I know we're coming up on our hour. So 2 quick questions to close us out. The first one is, what is the potential of graphic novels for portraying history as compared with other media, or adapting novels like Kindred or Bitterroot? What's been your experience of those?
I think there's an enormous potential for graphic novels to do that. I mean, there's been a few big ones in the last few years. There's John Lewis did before he died, there was a series of 3 books that told the story of the civil rights movement from his perspective. That wasn't even, I mean, it was partly geared at younger people, but not necessarily. But I have to admit that I came into the job without a huge grounding in graphic novels. I was sort of the portfolio that was handed to me. So I had to learn how to read them and how to appreciate them. But I've come to really see them as a unique and special art form. And there are things that they can do by the mixture of words, and images together on the page just creates something else. And I think a history, and specifically, it's funny because I have two young daughters, and they love graphic novels, and I do think that history can feel abstract to them, because they don't have. I mean, they're 11 and 8, so now this is not so much the case. But over the last few years, the concept of time is very difficult for them to wrap their minds around. It's something happened 100 years ago versus 500 years ago, and I think there's ways that you can visualize that so wonderfully on the page, with images. So yes, graphic novels are good.
And last question. When you recall earlier New York Times book review editors, are there any you really admire, or who served as mentors for you, like John Leonard, for example?
There's, I mean, I sit next to an editor named Barry Guin, who has been there for 35 years. He's the guy who gets the Lincoln biographies and the World War II histories. He has been a mentor to me, and I'm always sort of amazed by his just level of dedication to the job and his vast just knowledge of reviewers and of previous books. It's a job that it benefits you to have some kind of institutional memory, because authors have long careers, and to remember sort of who reviewed or how we reviewed or how a book was received by the same author 20, 30 years ago. Like, a lot of us are new and relatively younger. And Barry, who's in his late 70s, can always say, hold on, the flip side of it is he gets very, there's not a lot of stuff that surprises him anymore. So like, we had to take like the Holocaust memoirs away from him, for example, because he's been doing them for so many years that he's like, what's like, I've now seen all of this, before. And but yes, he has been a mentor for me. I'm trying to think of other people who, I've had some wonderful colleagues who have gone on to become critics. There's two in particular, Jen Salai and Parl Sagal, who are now one of the fiction and the nonfiction critics, are some of my closest friends, and in a way mentors too, because I so respect the way that they write about books and the thoughtfulness with which they approach the process of reviewing a book, which again, if you've written a book, if you're in this world, you understand. I feel so like sensitive deep in my bones to like how hard it is to do this. It takes so much out of you, that I never take lightly that responsibility I'll say that my first book was not reviewed by the Times. It was reviewed everywhere else, but it wasn't reviewed by the Times. And it still hurts me that it wasn't, so it makes me very sensitive and understanding of like what it means both to be reviewed and to not be reviewed. And so, and there's so much sort of effort and just sort of mental stamina that goes into producing even a bad book, that I just have a lot of respect for the form, along with the themes of my book, I still am so happy that it exists, that we have this form of communicating ideas that is one that allows for people to take years to produce them. That's wonderful that still exists in the world. So I'm just very respectful of that, because I think that we want to preserve it, and we want to honor the people who actually, give big chunks of their life to do it. I think that's it.
That's all the questions I think we've got time for. Thank you so much, Gal. That was
Yeah.
and I'll hand things back to Marge to close us out.
Gal, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really terrific. And thanks to everybody who helped make it such a lively conversation.